So today we'll be talking about actors in international relations, and our objective in this presentation is to identify who the actors are, what qualifies them as actors, and perhaps give a few examples of the actors that exist in international relations. All right, now for so long, states have been the major actors in international relations. They have played very significant role in international relations. All the way from the Westphalian Treaty with the establishment of the sovereign equality principle, down to the First, Second World War, even through the Cold War years, states have continued to maintain a very significant part in international system or in the international system in the order of things. And so they remain a very significant part or significant actors or primary actors, the major actors in international relations. But of course, over the years too, with the spread of globalization, industrialization, liberalization, especially the capitalist liberal campaign, we have had other actors come on stage, which were not necessarily absent before, but now their actions have become more significant. And so, rather than just state actors, we have other non-state actors as well involved in international relations, as in the current times or the contemporary era. It's also important to talk about transnational relations, because transnational relations particularly deal with non-state actors or these other category of actors that have come on stage that are not necessarily state actors, and Thomas Rees Kappen has defined transnational relations as interactions across borders that satisfy one of two criteria. They either are involved, or they either have one non-state actor involved in such interaction, or such interaction may not necessarily be in the interest of national governments or in the interest of international organizations or intergovernmental organizations. All right, so state actors, non-state actors have become the two major categories of actors in the international system, and we'll be talking about these categories, in the next few slides. But first of all, let's talk about what the features of international relations actors are. How do we identify actors as actors, or how do we identify groups, individuals as actors in international relations? Three very important features or characteristics that have been given here are the fact that, number one, such groups, such individuals, such organizations must be able to independently determine their own interests, their own purposes, their own objectives. So they must have the capacity to determine what objectives do we intend to achieve, when, and how. And secondly is the fact that they must also be able to mobilize sufficient resources, in pursuit of these objectives that they have independently determined, be they human resources, be they financial resources, be they material resources, all the resources that are needed to help them accomplish these set objectives must be able to be mobilized by these actors. And so that's the second defining characteristic. The third one is the fact that the behavior, the actions, the inactions of these actors, all right, must significantly influence the behavior of other actors, be they state or non-state actors in the international system. And so when these actors act or refuse to act, that must have implications for other actors in the international system. So these are three very important characteristics that help us identify, what groups, what individuals, what organizations qualify as actors in international relations or international system. They must be able to determine their purposes independently, their objectives and interests independently. They must have the capacity to mobilize sufficient resources that are able to help them accomplish these objectives. And finally, their actions and inactions must have significant influence on the actions of other, state or non-state actors in the international system. Now, here is a diagram that pictorially illustrates, the categories of international relations actors. State actors on the one hand, non-state actors on the other hand. And of course, under the non-state actor category, you have sub-state and transnational actors, under which you have further, you have intergovernmental organizations, you have multinational corporations or multinational enterprises, you have non-governmental organizations, and some might add terrorist groups as well. All right. Now, let's try and understand some of these actors independently. Now, state actors, like I said, are independent sovereign states, who have been the major actors in international relations for as long as the discipline has lasted. State actors have been very significant, and they're significant because the international system itself is structured in such a way that state actors are the dominant figures in the international system. The system is comprised of sovereign states. And so, naturally, these sovereign states occupy a significant role in the actions, in the inactions, in the policies, programs that take place or that go on in the international system. All right. Of course, state actors are represented by either their governments, by national governments, or by diplomats in some cases. And of course, there are so many state actors, over 200 of them, but the UN has currently a membership of 193 member states. And so that qualifies as an official figure, of the number of states that exist. Of course, even though we know that there are other states who are not members, who are not signatory to the UN Charter, and that doesn't rob them of their status as sovereign states too. Now, non-state actors are every other category of actors that are not sovereign independent states. All right. Of course, there are arguments as to what role intergovernmental organizations occupy, whether they are state actors or whether they qualify as non-state actors as well. And we'll talk about that when we get to intergovernmental organizations. But I just want us to note that non-state actors involve all other actors that are not essentially sovereign states. Okay, sub-state actors are actors that are a little more hidden, more unknown. You don't find this category of actors in so many sources, but these actors are actors that exist within the borders, within the boundaries of sovereign states or particular sovereign states. And of course, their actions, their inactions have an influence on the foreign policy of the state within which they exist. And of course, we understand that foreign policy is the tool with which states interact, correspond with other states. And so all actors that are able to influence foreign policy, directly or indirectly, have an influence on international system. And of course, actors who satisfy the other two categories or the other two criteria of actors, of the characteristics of actors, mean that they must be able to independently determine their purposes. They must sufficiently be able to mobilize resources that are able to help them accomplish these objectives. And so, sub-state actors will include categories such as investors, local businesses, manufacturing companies within the territory of the state. So they don't have an international presence, but the actions and inactions of these investors, of these actors, and of course investors now could be individuals too, individual investors who have the economic clout and power, that is necessary to make them very prominent, are very, very significant actors. So these are the category of actors that are referred to as sub-state actors in the international system, international relations. All right. Transnational actors, like we said, are actors that operate, non-state actors that operate across state boundaries. All right. And in most cases, their actions are not in the interest of national governments or international organizations. Those are transnational actors. All right. And of course, we have several of such transnational actors, three of which we'll be talking about are multinational corporations or multinational enterprises. I'll let you find out what difference exists between multinational corporations and enterprises, even though very thin, but there is a difference. All right, there is a difference between corporations and enterprises, and then you can find out on your own. But the point here is that multinational corporations, multinational enterprises are also actors in the international system. That's because they have an international presence. They exist in multiple states at the same time. They do businesses in these multiple states at the same time. They are obliged, to comply with the tax regulations, with the market forces, with the domestic policies of these states within which they operate. Okay, and of course they have significant influence also on the foreign policy of these host states, because multinational corporations are out to do business. They're not necessarily out to to align with states to achieve state objectives. They have their own objectives. Remember, they're able to independently determine their objectives. So multinational corporations independently determine their own objectives. They're able to mobilize resources and they are out to achieve these objectives. And so if state policies and programs stand in the way of multinationals, they look for other ways of doing their business and meeting the objectives at the end of the day. And that doesn't mean that in some cases the objectives of multinationals and those of states do not align. And where they align, where there are mutual interests, these multinationals work together with states to achieve such interests. But primarily, multinationals, have a more economic, a more profit-oriented interest, that drives the actions that they take or that they make, the actions and inactions. And of course, these also have an influence on foreign policy, which is a major tool for international relations. So once an actor is able to influence foreign policy, then more or less such an actor has an influence on international relations. All right. Non-governmental organizations are another category of international relations actors. And here, non-governmental organizations are essentially non-profit organizations. They're not necessarily out to make profit, but they're also sometimes in the interest of states and other times not in the interest of states, not necessarily in the interest of states. Okay, of course, there are both national and international dimensions to NGOs. Some NGOs have an international spread. The activities and actions have international dimensions. Some other ones are domestic NGOs, meaning that the activities are confined within the territories of a state. And of course, these activities can either be service activities or advocacy activities, humanitarian, human rights, women's rights, workers' rights, labor rights, and so on and so forth. These are advocacy NGOs. Service NGOs, on the other hand, are NGOs that are out to provide certain services, medical services, political services, economic, religious services. These are service NGOs. So you have these two categories of NGOs that are either local or international. And like I said, most times these NGOs are able to determine their own purposes. They're able to mobilize resources, whether through donations or subventions or dues or, however it is, they're able to mobilize resources. And the actions, of course, influence international relations, influence foreign policy, influence international relations, even on a larger scale. All right. Now, here we have included terrorist groups as NGOs, and that's because we believe that terrorist groups satisfy some of the some of the characteristics, or have some of the characteristics of NGOs. Some of which being that terrorist groups, are not essentially out for profit. They're not profit-oriented organizations, and of course, they don't exist necessarily in the interest of states or international organizations. So they qualify as transnational actors, which of course can also stand alone, but we tend to see them more also as NGOs. So whichever one you want to you want to choose, whether you want to group them as NGOs or you want them to stand alone, is fine. All right. But terrorist groups, the point is that terrorist groups are also very significant actors in the international system. And of course, these actors have become very much more prominent, in the recent past, as opposed to the very early days of the discipline of international relations. Intergovernmental organizations are also a very, very important set of actors in the international system, be they regional organizations or sub-regional organizations or the larger intergovernmental organizations on the international stage. All right. And that's because these organizations, are not sovereign states themselves. Even though the members of these organizations are sovereign states, but the UN, as an example, the UN is not a sovereign state. The UN doesn't have sovereignty. The UN doesn't have a territory. The UN doesn't have a population, other than its member states. The UN doesn't have a government, in the sense that a government is sovereign, is able to take decisions unanimously, or is able to take decisions unilaterally without influence from outside. So the UN is not a state, it's not a sovereign entity. So that doesn't qualify it as a state actor. The UN is more or less a non-state actor, even though it has as its members sovereign states. All right. Now the argument is that because the UN has member states has sovereign states as members, the UN can also be referred to as a state actor. But that defeats the purpose, that defeats the essence, the significance of state actors. Bearing in mind that state actors are sovereign, independent states who answer to no higher authority. All right, but the UN answers to the members of the UN. So that defeats the very essence of state actors. And so this presentation is basically arguing that intergovernmental organizations, or international organizations, as you may want to call them, are also non-state actors, because essentially they are not sovereign states. And so the UN, the EU, the AU, ECOWAS, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Association of Central African States, and all of these other regional organizations and international organizations, the World Health Organization, and so on and so forth. All of these are non-state actors. And do they qualify as actors? Yes, they do, because they're able to independently determine their purposes. They're able to mobilize resources, to achieve those purposes. And of course, their actions significantly influence the activities and the behavior of both their member states and, of course, other groups and individuals, actors who are not necessarily members of these organizations. And so they qualify as actors in the international system. Now, here are just a few examples of the actors that we have listed. Intergovernmental organizations, of course, they vary. They can be regional, they can be international, they can be sub-regional, as the case may be. And of course, the UN is one of such international organizations. The World Health Organization is one of such international organizations that is, of course, focused on the health, the public health, public security, public safety of the member states that are signatory to the World Health Organization treaty. All right. The World Trade Organization also is another sister organization to the WHO and of course to the UN, and it's more concerned with trade agreements, tariffs, trade restrictions, and ensuring basically that trade, occurs seamlessly, even though that is debatable. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is, of course, another international organization, even though this time around on a regional level, mostly restricted to the European states, and of course, is more concerned with military, with military security, with military alliance, and of course, all of those other issues. The World Bank, the IMF, are more concerned with development issues, with loans, financial issues, as the case may be. So these are some examples of actors that fall under particularly the non-state actor category. All right. Every other actor that is a sovereign state falls under the state category. Okay. So in conclusion, what we have said in this lecture is that state actors have for so long been the primary actors in the international system. They have been the primary actors in international relations. But all of that has changed in the contemporary times because other actors have come on board. Individuals have become very influential, have become very wealthy, that their investments, their behaviors, have significant influence on foreign policy, on the activities of even other states where these individuals are not, or to which these individuals are not directly citizens of. And so non-state actors have become also very prominent, and that has created two categories of international relations actors: state actors on the one hand and non-state actors on the other hand. And of course, the non-state actor category has some other subcategories: sub-state actors, and of course transnational actors, which we said would either constitute one non-state actor at least, or may not necessarily be in the interest of sovereign states or of international organizations or foreign intergovernmental organizations, as the case may be. All right. Now, of course, the controversy about NGOs and how terrorist groups, either conform or do not conform with categorization as NGOs under international relations actors continues to go on. But the point that needs to be made is that terrorist groups have become also very significant actors in the international system. And of course, the global war on terror, is just one evidence to show that the actions of terrorist groups, the activities of terrorist groups, have a very huge, a very profound, a very significant role, or influence on international system, on international relations. I hope that you have been able to understand, to benefit from this presentation. And of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. You have my contacts, and of course, we can continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you very much.